What is going on, everyone? Welcome into the Brant Partial Show. So, let's talk about the playoffs, college football playoffs. So, it looks like Florida State plays Louisville. We'll start with the ACC championship game. And to be honest, I haven't really watched Louisville a whole lot this year. I know Jeff Brom's done a really nice job of getting this program, winning some games this year. It goes to show that Jeff Brom, Purdue falling apart and Louisville having a lot of success just goes to show that Jeff Brom's a really good coach. And to be honest, I'd love to see Louisville beat Florida State. I think some people agree. Florida State, I think Florida State just needs to stay out of the discussion here because, Florida State, I heard several people talk about this. Florida State could be a 14, 15-point underdog in the playoff. And I've kind of went back and forth. So I used to be the guy that was all in favor of. Because the playoff criteria is the four best teams. But I used to be, the playoff committee does a little bit of the deserving factor. I used to be in favor of the four. Used to say, the four best teams with a little bit of deserving factor. I've kind of just retracted to the four best teams. Because I keep hearing these stats too. The playoff, the average margin of victory in the semifinal game is 19 points. So, knowing that stat right there, Florida State, now that playing with their backup quarterback, knowing they would be a 14 to 15 point underdog to whoever they play, and then even including like Ohio State, who currently sits at number 6. With that knowledge, you might as well, even though Florida State deserves to be a top 4 team, knowing what if based on what history has taught us, and Florida State, the way they looked against Florida with that backup quarterback, just with all that in mind, I think it's just safe to leave Florida State out of this. I think Texas versus Georgia would be an interesting matchup just because Texas beat Georgia. Texas has already shown they can match up and beat an SEC opponent. Obviously, just because they could beat Alabama, match up well with Alabama, doesn't mean they can beat Georgia. That's not always how that works. But knowing, I think that's key. Other people talk about this too. Knowing, college football, sometimes it's important to know what we know. Bruce Feldman was talking about this in the Rich Eisman show. Like LSU, when they beat Alabama in 2019, people knew LSU was for real. I think, kind of lost my train of thought there, but I think, So I think we know Texas can beat an SEC team. I think that's, if you want an argument for Texas, I know they lost to Oklahoma, but you think about it, Oklahoma, that's really not a bad loss. So you look at Texas. Texas has a really strong resume. I mean, obviously I don't always like the term quality losses, but like Texas this year, you kind of had the feel that just the way that Sarkisian's career's played out at Texas, you kind of got the feel that, like if someone told me Texas was going to lose one game this year, you kind of get the weird feel like they would have lost a game that they shouldn't have. But obviously they should have beat Oklahoma, but Oklahoma is still a solid team, and it's still Oklahoma. They're still well coached. They still have talent, and it's a rivalry game. So not necessarily a bad loss, but back to the point I was getting at is Texas. What we know. Okay, here's what we know is Texas can beat an SEC opponent, and we know that Texas can beat one of the SEC opponents that happens to be in the SEC championship game. So the case for Texas is, their one loss really is not that bad of a loss, and we know they can beat one of the at least top 2 SEC opponents. So, certainly a strong case for Texas. If Florida State, especially if Florida State happens to lose. The big question that a lot of people talk about, if Georgia beats Alabama, do they both not get in? Or does Georgia not get in? And then is Bama a shoo-in if they beat Georgia? This is one of the more interesting scenarios. And I think this was, I guess I sound like a hypocrite, but I guess if there is an argument for the 8-team, 12, obviously we're going to get the 12-team playoff, but if there was ever a season where, I would say, to me, I think even this year you could still argue, and not just this year, but in all years, 12 teams is too much. But if you could ever make an argument for a perfect year for a 6 to 8 team playoff. I think this year would be a prime example of that. So, and yeah, I mean, like as of now, like if we had an 8-team playoff, the first round would be the matchup we get in the SEC championship game: Alabama versus Georgia, 8 versus 1, and then Texas at 7, Texas, Michigan. What would it be? Who sits at 3? Washington, Ohio State, and then 4 or 5 would be Oregon versus Florida State. So, yeah, you think about it. Look at those matchups right there. That's some really good matchups, honestly. But yeah, Georgia a really good team, Michigan a really good team, Ohio State a good team. Tough loss to Michigan. Ohio State, like people have talked about, not as good offensively, but still a strong defense. Washington a good team. Oregon's going to be a really good game. During the season we did a preview of Washington versus Oregon. That's going to be a really good game. And Washington, the winner of that game should be in the playoff. I know that is the prime discussion is who gets in for that game, or is the winner a lock in that game? Well, I think if Washington wins, they have to be in, because that means they've beat Oregon twice, went undefeated, won the Pac-12. Looked pretty impressive for the most part. I know they've had some games where they didn't look the best. If Washington wins that game, they have to be in, and then the thinking is if Oregon wins, they should be in, or they'll be in. So, yeah, I think that's what's really tough. If you're Alabama, if you're Texas or Ohio State, you're on the outside looking in, is you have to. You're really you're kind of just you feel like there's 3 spots that are locked up. I think that's, I guess, if you kind of want to boil it down to the main point of why making the playoff is tough this year, is because Georgia, not necessarily, but you kind of have the feel Georgia, Michigan, Oregon are pretty much locks. Now, Georgia, but because, I know Georgia could lose, but that's everyone's still saying that even if Georgia loses, they're going to get in. So you feel like Georgia, Michigan, you feel like you're pretty sure of 3 spots as of right now. And even Florida State, Florida, although Florida State could lose, you get the feel that they are the better team than Louisville, and they should have enough talent, even with a backup quarterback, to find a way to beat Louisville. But yeah, Michigan, a really good team. I think the Michigan-Ohio State game was a really good game. Back and forth, tough, hard-fought game. Ohio State coming out victorious in the end. But yeah, just a really good football game. It really said a lot about Michigan, said a lot about Sharon Moore. So yeah, credit Michigan for coming out on top, and credit Ohio State. They've continued to improve. That defense looks good. Ohio State was a really good football team this year. Even if they don't get in the playoffs, I think it was just really tough that it had to go down like that way. But yeah, that's the thing. Ohio State now with a 12-team playoff, they're going to have a chance to get redemption on Michigan in the Big Ten championship and or in the college football playoff. So. Yeah, Michigan, Ohio State could play 3 times in the season. That's really crazy when you think about it. But yeah, I mean, the Pac-12 conference is no more, but I think I'd say it's fitting in a way that the last game of the Pac-12 conference is going to come down to Washington, Oregon. I think that's really interesting. This should be a good football game. I think. I think it'll be. It seems like everyone believes Oregon's going to win this game. I think one of the Oregon assistant coaches even said if they rematch, they would win. But there's something about, I might be wrong, but it seems like there's some about this Washington team. Washington was my initial pick to win the Pac-12, and I think Oregon. Oregon's got to be, I don't know what the line is, but you feel like Oregon should be the favorite to win this game just because it's tough to beat a team twice. But, you really have to appreciate what Washington's done, especially if they beat Oregon. Obviously, if they beat Oregon, then they've really earned, they've really put down their fist and really taken control of the Pac-12 and earned that spot in the playoff. We know that for sure if they beat Oregon, but that's one of those games where it would be just I guess another, some more terminology to describe it would be the exclamation point of like them saying like, no, we legitimately are the best team in the Pac-12 because we won all our games. We won a non-league game on the road against a Michigan State team that wasn't good, but they still annihilated them. And we, despite all the doubters, we beat Oregon twice, not only at home, but on a neutral site in the Pac-12 championship. So main point is Washington would really be staking its claim as the leader and the top dog in the Pac-12 and really just leaving no doubt in people's mind that they deserve a spot in the playoff. I keep wanting Washington. I think as a Michigan fan, I think Washington or Oregon will be a tough matchup. I think it's a little bit like the TCU thing last year. Even though TCU I don't think is as good of opponent last year as Oregon and Washington are this year, but I think it's kind of the same. You're kind of going down the same path for Michigan, and what I mean by that is Michigan's likely going to play the winner of that game. Michigan's likely going to be the favorite. Michigan, as a team, I think their mindset is going to be expect to win, but is that going to be healthy and beneficial for them? Knowing what happened against TCU last year, they were the favorites, and they were the you could argue it was a case of them overlooking TCU. I know that's always the go-to argument when a team doesn't perform well, is they were overlooking them. But credit, I think you have to give some credit to TCU, but Michigan was the better team. TCU played better on that night, but Michigan was the better team. But I guess back to what I'm getting at is I guess the main point is I think Michigan should win. I would pick them to win. I think most people will pick them to win. I think they'll be the favorite against Washington or Oregon, but it's going to be tough. And it certainly will present a challenge. Michigan's going to have to go against a really good quarterback, either in Michael Penix or Bo Nix, a guy that Penix not as much, but especially Bo Nix, a guy that can beat you with his legs, with his arm, a guy that's really playing outstanding football down the stretch. So I think it would be a tough matchup for Michigan, but an interesting matchup. It's a matchup where a lot of people. I think a lot of people would be excited to see. But I think, I worry with Michigan because I think you've seen this time and time again, not only in just the Jim Harbaugh era, but even going back to the Lloyd Carr era. As great a record Lloyd Carr had against top 10 teams, especially Big Ten teams like Wisconsin, Ohio State earlier in his career, and in Penn State, as much as success he had against those opponents, a lot of times when you saw Michigan play really good teams from the non-league, they really struggled. So I think that's what's worrisome is, say Michigan does play Washington beats Oregon and Michigan plays Washington, that'll be certainly be a challenge. I think if you. No, because last year I thought Michigan might blow out TCU. Turns out I was wrong, but I don't think when I made that take, it wasn't necessarily a crazy take based on TCU not, a lot of people not thinking TCU was that great, and based on, the way Michigan had looked at times. I think that's why I think it'll be a tough game for Michigan, because I think it'd be an absurd statement to say Michigan is going to blow them out. I think it's border. I don't want to say it's absurd, but I think it's a little bit. I think it's a tad crazy if you say Michigan's going to beat them handily. But bottom line, Michigan certainly could beat Oregon, Washington, but it's definitely going to be not going to be a walk in the park. And if they get through one of those teams, then you know you're going to have a tough battle. So I guess the main overall point is Michigan's going to have a tough road to win the national championship. As a Michigan fan, I think I speak for most Michigan fans. I think if this season ends in defeat, if they end walking off the field with their head, if they end the season not hoisting the national championship trophy, I think the hope is that it comes at the hands of Georgia. Because I think a lot of people, Georgia, everyone talked in the preseason how hard it is to three-peat, which is true. But I think a lot of people understood that. But I think also, the way Georgia's been playing recently, and that game against Ole Miss was kind of like the, oh, man, game as a Michigan fan. Because it's like it was that game where, and then I think for the rest of the country, it was kind of the oh, man moment. Like, oh, man, Georgia's for real. Like, Georgia, I think everyone keeps wanting to push that narrative with Georgia that they're just not as good as 2021. And they'll probably be saying that next, and then, they'll probably be saying that next year. But Georgia 2021 was, that was a defense we might not ever see again. But the thing is, I've talked about with Georgia, you don't have to be, sometimes to win the national title, you don't have to be as good as your team the year before. You don't even have to be, all you have to be is as good as the second best team in the country on the given year. So that's the thing. Georgia, even if Georgia's not even as good as last year, they still only have to be as good as the second best team in the country this year. So whether that team's Michigan, whether that team's Alabama, whether that team's Florida State, whether it's Oregon, Washington, Georgia only has to be as good as the second best team, and as good as the two teams, as the team they'll play in the SEC championship in Alabama, and then the two teams potentially they'd have to meet in the playoffs. So it's tough to three-peat, but Georgia, they show they can turn it on. Carson Beck playing good football. They're healthy. Brock Bowers is probably the best offensive player in the country. So yeah, Georgia. That's the thing with Georgia. I mean, you can keep saying their defense is getting worse or it's not as good, but like Georgia's still, their size at the line of scrimmage, on the offensive line, the way they can impose their will on the offensive line, similar to what Michigan can do, but maybe even at a better level. And a weapon like Brock Bowers, Carson Beck playing well in the run game, and a coach who's won national titles, Georgia still has all the ingredients to really put a hurting on people. So bottom line, Georgia is going to be really tough to beat. Three-peat, so hard to do, but if there's a program that can do it, why not Georgia? But yeah, I think Oregon may not win the national title. They might, obviously still might not get in the playoffs either, but I think Oregon's just going to be a tough out just because of the problem, the challenge that Bo Nix presents teams. I guess if you're going to go into the playoff and you knew you had one quarterback, Bo Nix probably would be at the top of the list for most people. And I keep forgetting, this whole talk about the playoffs, we might get a Oregon-Georgia rematch. If you talk about, when Dan Lanning and Oregon walked off that field, obliterated last year in that opening game, I think Dan Lanning, Kirby Smart came out and said he doesn't have a good players, but I think Dan Lanning knew. I think you kind of get the feel from his post-game press conference, if he was a non-competitive, negative guy, I think the way that game went, that could have really broken his career. But I think he looked at that game, what happened there, as the ultimate, early adversity to help his team grow. If you look at Oregon, they're built a lot like SEC. Dan Lanning's starting to kind of try to, not even kind of try. he's definitely started to make Oregon like an SEC team, physical at the line of scrimmage. We got a high level quarterback. We can put up points. We can move the ball. He's a young coach that just wants to just be elite. He wants to be great. Doesn't want to be good. Even has that quote, good is the enemy of great. So yeah, I think Dan Lanning, that adversity, I think he's moved on from that, but I don't think he's completely forgot about that Georgia loss. And I think, a chance to avenge that loss in the playoff, I think would be the ultimate. I think that would give Dan Lanning a lot of satisfaction. I think that could really just booster the Oregon program and really take it to that next step as they enter the Big Ten next year. But yeah, Bo Nix was a quarterback last year. A lot of Oregon players on that team, Dan Lanning, the Oregon players, they haven't forgot about that game. That was embarrassing. Since that game, Oregon has continued to get better. Bo Nix has continued to get better. Dan Lanning, I think, has continued to grow and get more confidence as a coach. So Oregon, all things pointing to a closer game if they were to meet Georgia. I think a win over Georgia, their confidence as a program would go through the roof. I know next year they would have a whole different team, but next year they'd have a different team. It would not be the same team, but Oregon certainly, that win would just, the amount of confidence for this Oregon program would just go through the roof. And I think that would, certainly wouldn't hurt recruiting. I think it would help it. Probably help it a little bit, maybe not a lot, but yeah, Oregon, more to think about an Oregon-Georgia matchup. Might not get it till the national championship if we did get it, but based off of seeding, but that would certainly be a matchup. People would immediately talk about the meeting last year in 2022, and people would talk about how, this would be a chance for Oregon and Dan Lanning to show how much they've improved and a chance to really get to make amends after that, crushing loss, even though it was a year ago. Because, yeah, that was, even though that was a year ago, that was one of those losses that can really deflate a program. It doesn't matter. Losses like that, people say, next week, next game, one game at a time. But sometimes losses like that can linger. Like, look at Michigan State 2015, that playoff loss to Alabama. That loss seemed to linger on that program for a long time for Michigan State. I know they had a good season a couple years ago. Well, 2018, they had a 10-win season. I know they had a good season a couple years ago, but never, Michigan State was never really the same after that. Clemson 2018, Clemson, that blowout loss to LSU in the national title in 2019 when people thought Clemson was going to become if Clemson won that year, Clemson would be talked about as the new dominant kings of college football. Got beat handily to LSU. So sometimes those losses, even though they're not devastating losses, sometimes they can kind of really set a program back. Even if it's not a huge setback, it can be a little bit of a setback that, makes that kind of that taste and that hunger, or makes that kind of that longing for a championship seem, much, much further away. But yeah, so Michigan, Iowa. So, with this game, the bottom line is Michigan, to win. Michigan most likely has to score 20. If Michigan scores 20, 21 points, you feel like this is a victory. I think, as Iowa, I think if you're the Iowa team, I think you got to embrace the underdog. This might be one of those games where Iowa comes out and they're just, they've soaked in the underdog and just used all the doubt as fuel to really jump on Michigan early. So don't be surprised if Iowa strikes first in this game, gets a lead, and then Michigan's like, okay, we got to, then you hear people are like, oh man, Iowa came ready to play, heavily underdogs, doubted, and then Michigan bounces back. So don't be surprised if something like that happens. But yeah, I think, this will be a game Michigan should win. This is a rematch of these two teams met in the Big Ten championship. I know that was 2 years ago, but you kind of get the feel this game could go similarly. Michigan could just, it could be kind of close. Iowa can hang around a little bit, the first half, and then Michigan has a couple big plays and kind of blows it wide open. That's kind of how the game went in 2021. I think we might see something similar to that. But, yeah, Michigan should get the win here. But, yeah, it'll be interesting. All right, so let's talk Alabama, Georgia. So, I guess, Georgia should win this game. I think, Georgia should embrace the opportunity to beat Alabama for the first time in the SEC championship game. The other win against them came in the national championship or Kirby Smart's signature win against Alabama came in the national championship. So Alabama, Georgia should embrace, should want to get that monkey off the back of beating Alabama in the SEC championship. I think that certainly is on the front of their mind. And yeah, Georgia, they want to, I think this is, last year they certainly earned the national title. I think this year, if they want to win another national title in Three-Peat, they want this thing earned, or they want to put an exclamation point on it, and they want it earned. They want it, they want the 15-0, undisputed, no loss, SEC champs and national champs. They want all, like every team, but they certainly want all the marbles and to leave no doubt in people's minds. So yeah, I think to me, I've kind of thought about this game a lot though recently. Not only I think it'll be a good game. I want to pick Georgia, but there's something telling me Alabama's going to win, and I kind of just I think in my mind, oftentimes the team that does win the game is the team I'm kind of I'm confident. I'm confident when I have that kind of that calm confidence when I think about them winning. So I think Alabama, I'm not ready to say right here that Alabama's going to win, but to me, I guess what I should say is I'm close to picking them. So I think Georgia is the better team, and I didn't really say that confident. I'll say that. I think Georgia is the better team. I think Alabama has improved. I think Alabama's a good team. I think they're playing well, especially under Jalen Milroe. But I think, Georgia should win this game. I think, I guess you always have to look at the motivation factor. If Georgia can still get in with this loss, I think, not that that'll hinder them, but I think it's one of those things where it's sometimes the desperate team, takes gets the win in this case. Alabama, if the two teams are close, which people think these two teams are close, Alabama it's a must win to get in the playoffs, as opposed to Georgia. It's a, win, lose and you still might get in. So sometimes in this case, when things are close, the more desperate team sometimes can pull it out. So Alabama may, Georgia may win, but Alabama certainly has a shot, and this one has a chance to be the best game of the conference championship games, and probably is the one that will draw the most interest, because I think a lot of people, including myself, will be interested to see how Alabama matches up with Georgia this year. I know they didn't get to meet last year. I think that was why people maybe, I shouldn't say questions Georgia, but I think a lot of people would be, even though Alabama wasn't great, how would Bama fare last year? But Bama's going to get their chance to square up with Georgia, and we'll find out what the outcome will be. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Stay tuned for more episodes and clips from the show. Till next time, peace.